One of the most fascinating stories in gaming right now isn't coming from a billion-dollar AAA blockbuster or a surprise console announcement. It's coming from a roguelike deck builder making a decision that most developers are terrified to make. Slay the Spire 2 removed one of its own bosses from the game completely. The Act 3 boss known as Doormaker is gone, and the reason why says a lot about modern game design, balancing philosophy, and one of the biggest contradictions in gaming communities today. Because players constantly say they want balanced games. They say they want fair challenges. They say they want strategic depth and meaningful choices. But the second developers actually make balancing decisions that affect something players personally enjoy, the conversation changes immediately. Suddenly balance becomes anti-fun. Suddenly developers are overreacting. Suddenly the community starts debating whether fixing the game is actually making the game worse. And honestly, that tension is exactly why the story matters. The removal of Doormaker isn't just about one boss encounter disappearing from one game. It's about why developers sometimes remove ideas that are genuinely good on paper. It's about the uncomfortable reality that a mechanic can be memorable, exciting, difficult, and even beloved while still quietly damaging the larger experience around it. And maybe more than anything else, it's about how modern gaming communities optimize games so aggressively that developers are forced to step in before players accidentally turn creativity into repetition. One of the hardest things for players to accept is that developers don't evaluate games the same way players do. Most players experience games emotionally. If something creates memorable moments, intense fights, exciting victories, or unique challenges, players naturally see it as valuable content. Developers, meanwhile, have to think about how every mechanic affects the overall structure of the game. They have to think about how one boss encounter impacts build diversity, long-term replayability, pacing, difficulty curves, card usefulness, player decision making, and future content development all at the same time. That difference matters. Because according to the developers, Doormaker wasn't removed because it failed to leave an impression. In many ways, it sounds like the exact opposite. The problem was that the boss became too influential over the way players approached entire runs leading up to Act 3. Instead of adapting naturally and experimenting with different strategies, players started building specifically around surviving Doormaker. That's a massive problem in a roguelike. Games like Slay the Spire live and die based on experimentation. The entire genre depends on unpredictability. Every run is supposed to feel different. Every card choice is supposed to create new possibilities. Every relic is supposed to encourage creative thinking. But the moment one encounter becomes so important that it starts shaping player behavior hours before it even appears, the game starts narrowing itself. Players stop asking, "What interesting build can I create?" and start asking, "What build survives this boss?" That shift changes everything. This is one of the biggest hidden dangers in strategy games and roguelikes, meta distortion. That happens when one mechanic becomes so centralizing that it slowly warps the entire experience around it. Over time, players unconsciously begin prioritizing whatever counters the biggest threat, even if it means sacrificing experimentation. And the craziest part is that many players don't even realize it's happening. They just slowly optimize the fun out of the game. That sounds harsh, but it's true. Modern gaming communities are unbelievably efficient at solving games now. The internet changed everything. The second a powerful strategy exists, it spreads everywhere immediately. YouTube guides appear, streamers showcase optimized builds, Reddit posts explain the strongest synergies, Discord servers calculate probabilities, tier lists form within days, entire communities begin converging toward efficiency faster than ever before. Developers are no longer designing games for isolated players figuring things out on their own. They're designing against millions of people collectively sharing information in real time. That makes balance far more complicated than it used to be. A mechanic that seems perfectly manageable during testing can become overwhelmingly dominant once the player base collectively analyzes it for thousands upon thousands of hours. Suddenly, one boss encounter doesn't just affect difficulty anymore, it affects community behavior. It affects deck construction. It affects which cards players value. It affects how people think about the game itself. And when that happens, replayability starts shrinking. What makes this situation especially interesting is how perfectly it exposes one of the biggest contradictions in gaming communities. Players say they want challenge. Players say they want balance. Players say they want variety. But communities naturally move toward dominance and efficiency every single time. That's not necessarily a bad thing either. Optimization is part of the fun for many players. Discovering powerful strategies feels rewarding. Breaking systems can feel satisfying. Finding combinations that make you feel clever is one of the reasons strategy games are addictive in the first place. But eventually, optimization creates side effects. Weak strategies stop being explored. Experimental builds get ignored. Creative playstyles become inefficient. And over time, the game starts feeling smaller even if technically nothing changed. That's where developers have to make difficult decisions. Because sometimes protecting long term variety means removing something that players enjoy in the short term. And that's exactly why the Doormaker decision is so risky. Removing content is one of the hardest things a developer can do because players experience removal as loss. You can improve dozens of hidden systems behind the scenes and many players won't notice, but remove one memorable feature and suddenly it dominates the entire conversation. That's human nature. People remember what disappeared more vividly than what improved. And honestly, developers know this. They know removing content creates backlash. They know players will question the decision. They know people will accuse them of balancing the fun out of the game. That's why many studios avoid making these choices entirely, even when problems clearly exist. But leaving balance issues unresolved can create even bigger problems later. One dominant mechanic eventually starts shaping future design decisions. Developers begin balancing new content around it. Difficulty curves become distorted, variety decreases, entire systems become harder to expand naturally because one earlier decision has too much influence over everything else. At that point, developers become trapped. And that's one of the biggest reasons modern games sometimes feel repetitive after launch. Studios are often afraid to make painful changes early, so smaller balance problems slowly become foundational issues later on. We've seen this pattern happen across almost every genre in gaming. A shooter has an overpowered weapon dominating multiplayer. Developers nerf it. Players get angry. A fighting game removes an exploit that became popular. Players get angry. An MMO adjusts a class rotation trivializing endgame content. Players get angry. A card game deletes a broken combo limiting deck diversity. Players get angry. The cycle repeats constantly because players don't just build strategies around mechanics. They build emotional attachments around them too. People invest time mastering systems. They identify with playstyles. They feel ownership over the things they enjoy using. So when developers change or remove those things, it can feel personal. That emotional reaction doesn't necessarily mean the developers are wrong, but it also doesn't automatically mean the players are wrong either. That's what makes balancing games so difficult. There's also another side to this conversation that deserves attention. Sometimes developers absolutely do overcorrect. Sometimes balancing decisions remove personality from games. Some of the most memorable moments in gaming history came from mechanics that were technically unbalanced. Broken speedrunning exploits became legendary. Overpowered weapons became iconic. Wild character builds became part of gaming culture. Imperfection can create personality. That's why balancing is never just about numbers. Developers aren't balancing spreadsheets. They're balancing emotion, excitement, unpredictability, fairness, and long-term replayability all at once. Too much imbalance can make games repetitive. Too much balance can make games sterile. Finding the middle ground is incredibly difficult, especially in a genre built around experimentation. And honestly, that's why I respect the developers for making this decision even if people disagree with it. They clearly believe the long-term health of the game mattered more than avoiding temporary backlash. That takes confidence, because it would have been much easier to leave the boss untouched and avoid controversy entirely. The larger lesson here extends beyond Slay the Spire too. Modern games increasingly function as evolving ecosystems instead of static products. Developers now analyze player behavior constantly. They track dominant strategies, retention patterns, build usage, and counter completion rates and community trends in ways that simply didn't exist years ago. Games evolve after launch now, and evolution requires difficult choices. Sometimes those choices involve buffs, sometimes they involve nerfs, and sometimes they involve removing ideas that were genuinely exciting but ultimately harmful to the overall experience. That's uncomfortable for players because we naturally focus on the immediate loss instead of the potential long-term gain. But developers often have to think months or years ahead. If one mechanic quietly damages variety over time, fixing it early may prevent much larger problems later. That's likely what happened here. At the end of the day, we probably won't fully know whether removing Doormaker was the right call until players spend more time with the game afterward. Maybe the overall experience became healthier and more varied. Maybe players discover new strategies that were previously being ignored. Maybe the developers redesigned the boss later in a way that preserves what made it memorable without letting it dominate the meta. Or maybe the community ultimately decides something special was lost. That possibility exists too. But regardless of where you land on the decision, this situation perfectly captures one of the hardest realities in game development. Sometimes good ideas still need to be removed. Not because they aren't fun, not because they aren't memorable, but because they affect too many other parts of the game in ways players may not immediately notice. And in an era where gaming communities solve and optimize games faster than ever before, developers are increasingly forced to think about long-term variety instead of just short-term excitement. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think Slay the Spire 2 made the right call removing Doormaker? Do gamers really want balanced games, or do we mostly just want our favorite strategies left alone? And do you think modern developers sometimes focus too much on balance at the expense of personality and creativity? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. And if you want even more content, check out my Patreon, where my latest exclusive is a deep dive into the rise of subscription gaming and its hidden cost. Thanks for watching. Game on.